Well, I was happily listening to the music playing over that introduction of the program, and the thought has just crossed my mind that maybe it was too happy and too bouncy. So why, do you ask? Well, because my guest on A Very Tall Man has a story that begins with horrors and pain that has me wondering, had I survived what he survived, what would my life have been like? And here's the sad thing. If I say the word Holocaust, there are some who have no idea what I'm talking about, and there are others who deny that it even happened. Now, reality says that in 20 years or so, there'll be no one left alive who actually went through what happened in the 1930s and 40s, where over 6 million, mainly Jews, were murdered. No one will be left alive to testify with authority to the inhumanity of man towards others. So for me, this is an important half hour. I hope you'll watch it with your eyes, hear it with your ears, and feel it in your heart. Here is a little piece that will tell you about my next guest. Whew. I find that very hard to watch.
Well, I don't find it too hard to watch, firstly because I've seen it a number of times, and secondly, although the memory of what happened at the time will always be with me, I'm not unduly disturbed by it being brought to the forefront again. I'm more disturbed by some of the other films that Perry Trotter produced with people who went through much more serious problems than I did. But nevertheless, it'll be a memory that will be with me for the rest of my life.
Is it important, do you think, that the generations coming through now know what happened?
It's very important because the generations, as you say, who are now still young, probably have never heard of the Holocaust, or if they have, know very little about it. And in order in some way to ensure that the likelihood of it happening again is not so specific, them knowing about it will help, I think.
Go back all those years. Do you have strong memories of those actual years?
I have memories of some aspects quite strong, others very dim. I was 6 years old when we were deported from Frankfurt in Germany, and they say that a child who lives through trauma is likely to have memory loss of the events. But generally, I still remember most of what happened at the time.
One of the wonderful things that you've done, Bob, is you've written a book for your family, and it's called From Darkness to Light. Can I just show you a little, you know it because you wrote it. In it, there's a poem that you wrote to your mum in 1945. It's up there on the screen.
Yes.
It's in German, so I have the English translation beside me. Can I read a wee bit of it out?
Yes, please do.
Okay. So it's for Mother's Day, and I'll start a wee bit further in. You go, I wish you much happiness for the future and that we soon return to well-ordered circumstances. We should always be together, you and your loyal young Robert. I always want to give you pleasure. You must henceforth always smile. You should from now on wake happy every morning so that you'll never again be sad. You should now forget all the suffering of recent times. And then you finish by saying, but whoever trusts in God has not built on loose sand. I've read that a number of times, Bob, and I can't believe that a 9-year-old wrote that.
Well, some of it is not original, particularly that last sentence, but it seemed to fit the purpose of the poem.
When it all finished, did you actually understand what had happened to you over those years?
Not immediately, because the adults shielded the children from the events that did occur, and it wasn't until some years later that I found out exactly what happened and the tremendous tragedy that occurred.
A number of people, while the war was on, had no idea that that was even happening to the Jewish people. When you were in the camp, did it ever cross your mind that, like as we saw before, that 90% of the people who were in the camp with you perished? Did you know what was happening?
I did not know it. I'm sure the adults had a fair idea, but they didn't pass that consideration on to their children. And as a result, I really wasn't aware in the camp, and we were there for 2.5 years, what was happening, particularly to those who were being shipped off to places like Auschwitz for extermination, in effect.
Yeah, it's just such, the words for extermination, it's just horrendous to even hear you say that.
Well, it was a state-organised venture, and that's the tragedy of it. It wasn't an isolated case of persecution of individuals. It was a state policy to get rid of a whole race.
One of the pictures that sort of endures in a lot of people's minds are people being herded into those cars on the railway track, and you look at that, and I know that you weren't in that particular photo. You were in a bit more, in a slightly different situation, but that just seems so terrible. What must those people have been thinking?
Well, it not only seemed terrible, it was, and many people actually died on the train through overcrowding and just inability to cope with what was happening. We were a little more fortunate in that the carriages which took us from Frankfurt to Theresienstadt were a little better quality than these, but nevertheless there were just over 1,000 people in that particular transport, and it wasn't comfortable.
How many members of your immediate family were killed or died as a result of what happened?
Well, in Theresienstadt, my 2 grandmothers and my father. But in the wider sense, many more. An uncle, aunt and cousin of mine were murdered in Auschwitz. And of course, when we come to talk about my wife Freda's experience, many more lost their lives during that period.
And her story is a little bit different in so much as she never ended up in a concentration camp.
What happened was that her mother, and she was born in Poland, realized that there was little prospect of Freda surviving as a 3-year-old, as she then was, and she took her to a friendly Catholic lady on a farm, left her there, and that was the last time she saw her mother, her father having already been shot by the Nazis when they entered the town. So she didn't quite have the same experience, other, of course, than being an orphan from then on. And this lady, a Catholic lady, looked after her for 3 years at a great risk to herself and her teenage son, but she survived.
Did you ever get a chance to go back and say thank you?
We got a chance to go back with our children to visit the town, but there was no way of tracing the lady in that there was a tremendous movement of people at the end of the war, particularly when the Russians came in from the east. We had no idea what happened to her until quite recently, when we found out that she and her family had shifted west into Poland. The town had in the meantime become part of Belarus, but she would by now be 125 years old, so obviously there was no prospect of meeting her. But we have by chance been in touch with a grandson and 2 great-grandchildren of hers who are about to get an award by the Israelis for what they did in sheltering and rescuing Freda.
One of the little things that you often see associated with the Jews and the Second World War and that terrible time is that little yellow star. Can you just hold that up and talk to that for a moment, please?
Well, as soon as the Nazis came to power, or shortly after, all Jews in Germany and ultimately in all the conquered territories were required to wear the Jewish star on their outer clothing as a method of identification and also an easy way to harass us because we lost all protection of the law and we became not second-class citizens but non-citizens.
So that star that is on your jacket now, is that a replica?
It's not a replica, it's the original.
Well, does that feel strange putting it on?
No, not really. I think it's a good demonstration of some aspects of what happened to us.
One of the things that interests me about this is that my mother was in a Japanese prisoner of war camp in the Second World War, and I never sat down and had the conversation with her that I'm having with you now. And I don't know why I didn't do that, and I feel that I've missed out, and there's maybe stories that Mum could have shared. Do you think that we should be speaking more about this?
Absolutely, I have the same regrets. As far as Freda is concerned, of course, she had no opportunity to speak to her parents. But I didn't ask my late mother enough about the experiences which I only vaguely remembered. She didn't volunteer stories. She would answer questions, but not enough of them were asked of her. And as a result, when we wrote this book, there are gaps there which might have been filled. And we always encourage young people, particularly when we speak to schools, to talk to their parents, their grandparents, in order to be familiar with the history going back as far as possible so that it doesn't disappear with them.
What has been the response from most of the students when you share your story?
The response has been surprisingly good. Interest is shown in the story, in some of the lessons we tried to convey about the consequences of harassment, persecution, discrimination, and ultimately, of course, genocide. And we relate it to, as far as they are concerned, to bullying in the playground, encourage them to be upstanders rather than bystanders. And I think the message gets through. It depends to a large extent on the interest of teachers to bring the subject to the forefront, and that is happening more and more.
Did you ever at any stage in the last 50 or 60 years stop and ask God why this happened to the Jewish people?
No, I haven't. I'm not a deeply religious person, but I'm traditionally Jewish, and we take it as an event of history although of course rather more tragic than any other that has occurred. And we don't really feel that we can blame God, if you want to put it that way. It's just what happens, and it's by no means the first time that there's been persecution of Jews over the centuries, and of others, of course. We're not the only ones, but this was on a more organised basis. And some of the survivors, and there are not too many of them, feel that there can't be a God because
there can't be a God.
Can't be a God, as he would not have allowed it to happen. On the other hand, it did happen, and we feel that we have to retain and promote our Judaism for the sake, if nothing else, for the memory of those who didn't make it, not only our family, but the many others.
So where do you stand? Do you believe there is a God?
Yes.
Yeah. And so the idea, though, that God would allow this to happen hasn't something that hasn't bothered you?
Well, I sometimes obviously have to ask myself, how can that happen if there is a God? But the fact that it did happen and the fact that I believe in God somehow managed to live side by side.
So as the years went by, did what happened to you and your family make you even more determined to be a success in life?
I never consciously sat down and said to myself, you've now got to succeed in life. I just went on with living, and as it happened, it's turned out really well, particularly because we're fortunate enough in coming to New Zealand, became citizens as soon as we possibly could, and both Freda and I consider that we arrived in paradise when we came here, and we wouldn't have it any other way. Even though our 3 children and 8 grandchildren are now in Australia, we are here and intend to stay here.
So how did you arrive from Germany, Czechoslovakia, Switzerland to New Zealand?
The story that I've recently found out is that in early 1945, a group of Orthodox Jews in New York raised $1 million, which through a Swiss intermediary offered to Himmler, one of the high Nazi officials, if he would let 1,200 people get out of Theresienstadt. And that was in February 1945, 3 months before the war finished. Although most people didn't believe that that was actually what would happen, I persuaded my mother to be one of the volunteers, and we finished up in Switzerland. We're there for 2.5 years. In the meantime, my aunt and uncle, who'd come to New Zealand before the war, found out that we'd survived and got us, with some difficulty, a permit to come to New Zealand. When I say us, my mother and I, who were the only survivors of the immediate family. And much the same happened with Freda, who had family here, and when they found out that she and her sister, and there's a story to her sister's rescuing Freda, had survived, they also got them a permit to come to New Zealand.
So bought with a price?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
He was probably not able to spend it because he was prosecuted at the Nuremberg trials, and I think he was gone before the money.
Yeah, well, Christians understand the concept of bought with a price.
Yeah.
You mentioned there was a story with Freda and her sister.
Yes, what happened was that Freda had 2 older sisters as well as her parents. One disappeared with the mother and was never heard from again. But the oldest one, Lisa, managed to escape from a ghetto, joined a group of partisans in the nearby wood, and tried to disrupt, and in many cases successfully, the German war effort by blowing up trains and tanks and so on. And after the war, she came to the farm where Freda was hidden and was able to persuade the lady who sheltered her to let her go with her.
It's a wonderful story, isn't it?
It is a good story.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so Freda made it to New Zealand, and you guys got married, and you don't have an accent. Like you sound as Kiwi as I sound.
Well, we both came here without a word of English, but the theory is that up to the age of 12, when you learn a new language, you generally lose your accent. So I hope I haven't got too much trace of the original.
Well, Freda has also won an award in New Zealand that the Governor-General gave her. What was that for?
Well, she got a Queen's Service. Yes, she got a Queen's Service Medal for community service. She originally trained as a laboratory technician, but then we decided to have a family. And when they were old enough, she took on a second career of marriage guidance counselling, and she did that for 25 years. Subsequently joined the Citizens Advice Bureau, firstly as an advisor and secondly as a trainer of volunteers. And she's worked in various pro bono organisations, and that was recognised.
One of the things that seems to be happening in this day and age is discrimination. Whether you're black, white or whatever, you're an immigrant. Have you ever felt discriminated against in New Zealand because you were Jewish?
I personally, and I think Freda is much the same, have never experienced anything that you might call, certainly no persecution or discrimination. But lately in particular, we're finding that there is a growing anti-Semitism in New Zealand as well as, of course, in many other countries in the world, and that's very disturbing.
You mentioned before that you see New Zealand as paradise. A lot of Jewish people want to go to their promised land, want to go home to Israel. Is that something that you never considered?
No, we never considered it. It was a land promised by God to Moses, and it's considered to be the homeland of the Jews because, of course, there was no country which would regularly admit Jewish people immediately after the war, so the State of Israel was effectively re-established because Jews had been living there for millennia, and it became a country that would admit Jews from anywhere without asking any questions. But we were so settled here that we saw no reason for going there.
Have you mentioned you've been back to Germany, right?
Yes.
Yeah. When you saw German people, did that cause any feelings of angst in your heart and your mind?
It didn't produce a feeling of hatred by any means. It brought back memories, and the best example of that is when I was asked to address a group of senior students at the school where my father had taught, secondary school, and from which he had been dismissed by the Nazis because they considered it no longer appropriate for a Jew to teach non-Jewish children. At the end of my little talk, question time, one of the boys asked whether my children would hate them. And the simple answer was, of course not, you weren't here at the time, you're not responsible for it. And I have no strong feelings, certainly not about Germany and generally not about the Germans. On one occasion when we were travelling in a train and in the compartment opposite us there was an elderly gentleman with only one leg. I couldn't help wondering where he might have been when Freda's parents were killed and my father and grandmothers died, but that's about the extent of it. And I must say that generally the Germans have done their best to recognise what happened and in a way to atone for it.
So does the concept of forgiveness come into your thinking? Have you consciously thought, I forgive them, or did you not think that was as necessary?
Well, I can't forgive in the, if you like, in the religious sense, those who were responsible for it, who were actively involved in what was happening. I mean, it's indescribable what did occur. So I can't forgive that, and I can't forget it. But I have nothing to forgive to those who weren't involved.
So what happens now, the next 20 or 30 years? You've written your book for your family. As you mentioned, there seems to be a little more discrimination against Jewish people. Is it possible in your mind that something that happened in the 30s and 40s could happen again?
It's by no means impossible, but I would like to think that some lesson has been learnt from the murder, not only of 6 million Jews, but many others who were considered unsuitable by the Nazis. There has been and will continue to be a degree of discrimination and persecution. Whether it will happen again, who knows? But I can't imagine that it will happen to the extent and on as organised a basis as it was then.
When you sit down with your children, who are now adults, they ask you about what happened in that concentration camp. Do you have a general response that just sort of that you give them? You say, this is what happened and this is how I feel about it?
Well, the children grew up with the knowledge of our experiences. We never consciously sat them down and said, right, we're now going to tell you our stories, although this is now done in the context of the book. But as we went through life with them before they left home, this inevitably cropped up in their studies. They have learnt more detail than we were able to give them, and they're very conscious of what happened, and all three of them and their children are conscious of it.
Bob, when we began the program, we played that little clip that Perry Trotter so beautifully put together. And I looked at your eyes, and at times I thought they looked sad. But I found a photo that's on the cover of your new book of you and Freda, and I thought, it's just a beautiful photo, and I want to put it up now so that everybody can see it. And it just basically goes, there's a couple, excuse me for saying this, a beautiful older couple who look happy with themselves and happy with life. And I just wanted to say, on behalf of all of us who had nothing to do with what happened in the 1930s and 40s, but we are so sorry, and we just ask for God's blessing on your life.
Thank you. And this session is lest we forget.
Amen. God bless you, Bob.
Thank you.